allow these people to continue to steal in the sense that they completely disregard like the consequences of their actions. We think that in their case, like, a lot of people are left scot-free, that they're not apprehended, and it's difficult for them to change and rehabilitate. In our paradigm, where we give these criminals like a prison sentence, they will actually we think that we better help them rehabilitate because we actually give these petty criminals a prison sentence in the first place, and they actually feel longer than they usually do. However, we still achieve the best of both worlds because ultimately the time they spend in prison is shorter than what is actually happening in crime status quo, and like the overcrowding and like these prisons will be solved. Secondly, we think that we also like to achieve rehabilitation because we give a longer time for these criminals to reflect on their actions, on their crime. And we think that this time spent in prison is extremely important, right? Especially since there's nothing for them to do other than like the normal chores which prisoners are subjected to. We think that this time to reflect on what they are doing, the things which they are missing on, which will be especially prominent because they have such a long prison sentence which they in their mind. We think that this does help them to rehabilitate. Because of all I said, I'm very proud to take this. Thank the Prime Minister and invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello. Sorry. Okay. If you pay very close attention to the Prime Minister's speech, you'll realize there's one thing sorely lacking: a description of what it's like to have time extended for you when it's not actually possible. So we're going to explain to you very clearly what this feels like before I look into any rebuttal, because we think that's important to this debate. It's essentially, Mr. Speaker, sensory deprivation, because your body is no longer able to perceive at the rate in which your brain requires it. Everything to you stands still. That is the kind of prison sentence they're talking about. There's no room for counseling because everybody who's talking sounds way too slow to be understood. That is the world where the people just stand there for 5 minutes and it feels like 20 years. Mr. Speaker, that is not a world we want prisoners to go to. We don't think it's fair on side opposition. 2 points of contention we want to deal with on side opposition. Right? First, let's look at the idea of deterrence. Second, let's look at the idea of rehabilitation. But before that, let's look at opposition's counter policy. If their problem is overcrowding, Mr. Speaker, we are very happy to use any kind of alternatives that are possible at our service, right? So stepping up law enforcement so people feel deterred from committing crimes in the first place, using alternatives, no safety madam, like house arrest. We don't think this is a justification to inflict the level of psychological trauma that their side doesn't even realize they're inflicting on individuals. No thank you. So, first point of contention, let's look at deterrence. So they told us, well, you know, there are people who are let out scot-free, but now there's going to be more space in prisons. First and foremost, we think that in and of itself, right, there's not a reason why you should subject this individual to the level of psychological torture, almost like sensory deprivation, because these individuals' bodies cannot keep up with the level that their brains require. We think that it's almost like solitary confinement. We already know the kinds of effects that solitary confinement has on individuals when they blur the lines between what's reality and what's fantasy. This causes a great deal of confusion and a great deal of psychological trauma and even post-traumatic stress disorder amongst individuals, which is why we think we're discontinuing things like solitary confinement increasingly. Secondly, right, we think just because it has a deterrent effect doesn't mean that we need to resort to the highest possible form of punishment. If that were the case, Mr. Speaker, we would just give everything the death sentence. But that's obviously not the case under the status quo. There is some degree of proportionality that needs to be upheld. Something my second speaker will be talking to you about. I'm just going to destroy the idea of proportionality in the legal system. But until then, this will have to be sufficient. Second point of contention, let's look at the idea of rehabilitation. Now, this is very airy-fairy idea, you know, because you can have more time in prison, you technically can have more counseling. Okay, look, the fact of the matter is, you're going to be in prison for what, 10 minutes? Because what it's going to feel like, what is actually going to be 10 minutes, that to you feels like 20 years. What does this mean? This means that anybody who's not functioning on the same frequency as you is going to be unable to interact with you because your brains are functioning on different speeds. Your brain is processing at a level at which a normal human being cannot understand or be able to deal with. This means that the only ability for counseling to ever happen is quite simply if that person also undergoes the drug. Which means the counselor has to undergo the punishment of the prisoner as well, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? If you subject counselor to this kind of psychological trauma as well. We're going to talk about my two substantives now, right? First, I'm going to explain to you why on the short term this creates a great degree of harm to both the individual and to the rest of society. Second, let's talk about the long-term harm to the prisoner. First idea, what are the short-term harms to the prisoner? We need to accept, right, that at the end of the day, what's going on is that a person's sense or pace of time is being accelerated at a pace at which the human body is not adept to be able to deal with. What does this mean? This means at the end of the day, what occurs is that although it feels like 5 seconds are passing, it feels like 5 hours are passing me by, it's in reality 5 seconds. This means that any form of ordinary sensory data that your brain receives is automatically ignored because it cannot be recepted by the brain. The same way, Mr. Speaker, if a smell stays in a room for too long, you cannot smell it anymore. We're talking about the same degree here, except that it's happening in mere seconds, so quickly that your ability to perceive anything around you becomes completely blocked out by your brain's need for the immense amount of sensory data that your body cannot provide. Is this disjunct, Mr. Speaker, that they fail to understand on site government? Yes.
If they are so sensory deprived, as you say, how is it that they are able to actually feel the long sentence, they are able to feel the concept?
Because the perception of time doesn't happen on your skin, Mr. Speaker, it happens in your mind. What your perception of time is, happens in your brain. I feel like it's there, I feel like time is passing, I do not feel it physically. It's an emotional and mental kind of feeling that just like to comprehend, right? That your perception of time is something that's mental and not physical in nature. But what does this create in a prisoner, right? So first and foremost, we think that level of sensory deprivation was not something that the human psyche was ever built to kind of tolerate or withstand in any manner. We talk about how people in solitary confinement already experience great amounts of post-traumatic stress. But more than this, right, we talk about the psychological trauma of being unable to interact with the world around you or with people around you for what to you feels like 20 years. That is ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. Given that we already only do solitary confinement for things like 1 day, and that's the maximum we can ever give a prisoner, 20 years is ridiculous. It's going to drive 3/4 of the prisoners insane under their policy. But more than this, right, we think this creates an even greater, on my second argument, and bringing an even greater inability to rehabilitate. Because not only can you not counsel this person, because you know his time is passing way faster than you have the capacity to deal with, it also means that he is unable to interact or build the kind of skills that prison is supposed to imbue in people. Things of self-discipline, a sense of order in your life, things like routine help people retain a sense of normalcy. The man's prison sentence is now 20 minutes of sitting in a jail cell to what feels like 20 years. That is not a sense of rehabilitation in any possible way. It's not possible to counsel this person, it's not possible to imbue the skills of things like self-discipline, things like a routine into this individual that we think we value in prisoners or what we consider a prison lifestyle anyway. Let's move into my second argument on the idea of long-term harms. We need to acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, that what we do is we create a psychological dissonance between a person's mental and physical age. When he feels 20 years older than his body actually is, we think what happens is you create the kind of trauma when a person either A, feels superhuman because you know he's 20 years older but feels 20 years younger. And that creates and that encourages the kind of egotism that leads to criminal behavior in the very first place. But more than this, right, it leads to a displacement of identity as far as these individuals are concerned, where they cannot reconcile their physical and mental ages, much like you can't during puberty, much like what people experience during a midlife crisis, only like far, far worse. We think what happens is that you create this inability and this disjunct between a person's perceived age and his actual age. And this is problematic because it creates the sort of harms that prevents this individual from feeling like an ordinary member of society when he feels like an 80-year-old man in a 60-year-old body. That is ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. We cannot allow for this level of harm to exist in society, and for all these reasons, I'm extraordinarily proud to oppose the motion.
Yeah.
The leader of opposition. Now I invite the speaker.
Yeah.
We think it's absolutely ridiculous that they came out to tell us all about technology-ridden things that is already out of imaginary. We think this type of technology are using is ultimately lengthening the kind of sentence and not going to cause the kind of sensory deprivation that they're talking about. That ultimately, those harms that I pointed out are not actually mutually exclusive happening in jails anyway, right? That prisoners are still being isolated in jails. We don't see why this is especially a problem. This is a problem that's only present in our case, or even present in our case at all. Now, two main points of contention before I move on to my substantive argument. Firstly, on the idea of deterrence, and secondly, on the idea of rehabilitation and long-term problems they pointed out. Firstly, on the idea of deterrence, they point out on the idea of sensory deprivation. Firstly, we tell you that really in jails, there's really a sense of being isolated. We tell you that's the purpose of jails, right? When you're being placed in an isolated cell, that is where rehabilitation really occurs. Because you're able to feel being isolated from society, because you're able to be really be able to reflect your actions, right? We tell you it's something good, because that's what really fuels the kind of deterrence effect that we want in jails. And also, we say that this kind of psychological trauma is not because we lengthen the kind of sentences that have, but because they're labeled as criminals in the first place. We tell you that once they enter jail, any kind of trauma will have been caused already, right? And we tell you that this is something that's not mutually exclusive of any side. And we tell you that the sensory deprivation they pointed out is really not present, right? That they didn't deal with our speaker's case at all. They completely misrepresented our case. But we came to tell you on the idea of how that we're simply mentally lengthening the kind of sentences without having kind of weird theological side effects that they pointed out to you. Now, secondly, they brought us an idea of proportionate deprivation. Firstly, we see that it's not in the fullest form as they pointed out. As pointed out correctly, they were not giving them a death sentence. They tell you that a clear line must be drawn between when deterrence is enough. And we see that in cases such as petty crimes, deterrence is simply not achieved. Because there's a kind of shortened sentences make it very hard for prisoners to really reflect their crimes and to really rehabilitate, right? And that's also why there's need for this policy to be in place. Because even though the justice system is still in place, even though they're still serving the punishment for their crimes, they will better achieve the kind of deterrent effect, something they've never once contested from their side, right? And thirdly, on the overcrowding being sought through funding. Now, firstly, we see that there's certain limitations in the government today. And we see that why there's already a problem of overcrowding is because of the lack of funding in the very first place. And then we see that overcrowding cannot be simply solved by increasing prisons and prison cells. Hold on a minute, sir. We see that the only way to solve it is by having this kind of technology in place. But before I move on, explain, yes, sir.
Be the first speaker on your side to explain to us how you're going to lengthen these sentences without displacing these people's physical and mental identity.
We see that this kind of physical and mental identity is already lengthened kind of in prisoners who serve a very long sentence, right? Because we're letting feel as if they're serving a long sentence anyway, even though the technicality of it is still maybe 2 months, right? And we see that this kind of lengthening, right, is what really fuels kind of deterrence effect. And we don't see why there's a problem that we must solve, right? Now, second contention on the rehabilitation, when he brought to us the idea of how it comes essentially numb, being unable to listen to the kind of counseling that occurs. Firstly, we say that it's not as simplified as they point out to be, right? We tell that rehabilitation occurs if you are placed in a long time in prison cells. You're just able to think through the kind of actions that you have, and you're able to suffer the kind of punishments that you have. And you know that you have to pay for the crimes that you commit, right? And we say that this is the kind of rehabilitation that happens in prisons. And we say that anyway, if the sensory are really going to be deprived, right? They're not going to be as suffering from psychological trauma in the first place. And we see that there's a tension in their case. When they cannot realize that they're going to be numb from the kind of counseling, and yet they're going to suffer some huge psychological trauma. But even so, we see that rehabilitation can still occur, even through counseling. That prisoners are still going to take the kind of normal counseling that any prisoners have, right? And we see that as long as it works for other prisoners, we don't see why this is something that will not work in the case of in our case. Now, moving on to a substantive on how we better the social justice system and better society as a whole. Firstly, let's look at the criminals that we want to talk about today. We see that the criminals, especially for crimes like theft, etc., they're essentially poor criminals, right? They're so breadwinners in the kind of family that they have, and then after their job, the families are often left to fend for themselves in the society. We tell that this creates certain trickle-down effects on family members when they're being forced into poverty, even though it's only one of the family members being committing a crime. And we say that we cannot shorten the actual sentences of this. The justice system cannot take into such social factors. And yet, we are punishing the family members for the kind of crimes that this individual is committing. So and we see that this technology is able to solve this problem. Will thank you, sir. We see that firstly, for family members, we take away this kind of suffering. Even though sentences are technically shortened, that means that prisoners get released earlier, the punishment is still the same, right? Will thank you, sir. And they can still get when they're released earlier. This also means that they can better integrate the society faster and get the kind of income that the family needs, right? Will thank you, sir. And we see that this has certain effects on society if these families are being affected. Then firstly, certain dire situations are going to cause more crime to happen in society, right? That often have things like increased crime rate happens when a lot of families are being left to fend for themselves without a sole breadwinner. And we see that this also means that we are ultimately causing harm to the society. No thank you, sir. When such things happen, right? And we see that this is not something that we essentially want in the society today. Secondly, we also say that we better the kind of justice system that we have. Because firstly, we take away the social factors that essentially affect the kind of punishment that the criminal have, right? That even though that the criminal does not have to think about certain things like their own family, whether it can survive outside while serving their own sentences. And I think that this fully achieves the kind of punishment that we have without compromising on certain innocent people, and yet we benefit the society by ensuring that no families fall into dire situations that forces them into crime. And we also say that ultimately these benefits are going to trickle down back into society when we create the kind of proportionate justice system that we have. That even though we allow for equal punishment, we still allow for the kind of rehabilitation and integration in society to be much better in our case. And because of all these reasons, we see that firstly, this technology will better allow for deterrence effect, better allow for rehabilitation, and therefore we see that we need to have this technology in place for prisoners.
I invite the leader of opposition.
I'm a huge fan of science fiction novellas, and I think that one of the best pieces I've ever written was this piece called The Jump by Stephen King. And essentially what this entire novella was about was this individual who, had to go through a drug that made him feel as if time had been extended for his body. That he had to sit there, and feel the time going on. And even though it was only about 5 minutes, it was an almost instantaneous experience. That individual came out insane. Because in that particular time, as time was being lengthened in his mind, he was not able to move, he was not able to understand what was going on around him, and all he had was white noise for what felt like 100 years. His body could not keep up with his mind, and all he could do was simply sit there and wait for the time to pass. We think that is a kind of abhorrent reality that they want to force upon our criminals, that we also believe have certain human rights. And we think that they've never once engaged with us on this particular issue because there is no way they can ever justify this kind of psychological torment on any human being, no matter what crime they've caused. We have 3 points of contention today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about whether this is a legitimate form of punishment. Then I'm going to talk about how we better serve justice, and especially the 3 tenets of justice in retributive justice, deterrence, proportionality, and the idea of rehabilitation. And then I'm going to talk about what's better for society as a whole. My substances will be intertwined, and I'll flag them out to you as they come along. But before I move on, let's talk about alternatives to their problems. Because what essentially is the crux of their argument? They said that look, the problem we have is overcrowding, and from that all the corollaries of the lack of deterrence comes about. We think that there's a problem for lack of funding for these prison cells. Then we think governments can divert funds towards prisons, especially if the problem is as pressing as they want to paint it out to be. What's even more important is that we think that if there's really such a problem, we can do things like get the UN to fund your state prisons. Right? There are other ways of you getting certain prison cells. Privately owned prisons is another alternative that certain countries are going towards. We think there are multiple alternatives to the problem they talked about, and their entire case is simply an argument for better funding and regulation in prisons, and not this specific motion that we're talking about. But let's move on to the first area of clash. Is this a legitimate form of punishment? And do we think, so the first question we have to ask ourselves therefore is, do criminals deserve a certain level of human rights? Do we do things that denigrate their identity as a human being simply because they committed a crime? And we think the answer to that is no. That's why we don't use things like torture, for instance, to deter individuals from committing certain crimes. And what's even worse is their very characterization of these type of individuals is that they're individuals who have committed petty theft, petty crimes, things that would never have ensured them a long prison sentence in the first place. But what they are essentially saying is that they want to put them in jail, lock them up for 2 to 3 years, sensory deprivation. They would even put rapists and murderers in there for 10, 20 years under this kind of sensory deprivation because of overcrowding. We don't think that's legitimate. Why? Will they feel the time pass? Obviously, we accept that these individuals will feel the time pass. That's why they're pushing for this policy. But what is the problem? And they never quite understood the nuances coming from my first speaker. Because what happens when, in reality, you've only sat there for 20 minutes? but your mind perceives it to be 2 years or 3 years. No, thank you, madam. Or 30 years. What does this mean? That means that in reality, you haven't actually done anything, but your mind is moving so quickly that your body cannot keep up with it. That means that you have absolutely no interaction with any other human being, because in that 20 minutes you're simply sitting in a jail cell. Your mind thinks that you haven't talked to another human being for 20 years. That means no, thank you, madam. It's a kind of psychological trauma from solitary isolation. What's even worse is we told you it's like sensory deprivation, because you can't hear anything for the last 20 minutes, because every single second is sped up to an eternity. That means that any sound that you hear, any smell that you could smell, any feeling on your skin is all eroded by the fact that it's so slow, you can't even realize the changes that happen to you. We think that's specifically bad. What's even worse is the loss of basic body autonomy, because your body can't even keep up with the way your mind is functioning. No, thank you, madam. The same as holding someone down in restraint for 20 years. We think that's specifically bad and an abuse to human rights. So we don't think it's a legitimate form of punishment in any sense. But how do we better ensure justice? And let's deal with the main crux of the idea, right? Because we talked about deterrence. But we think that, Madam Speaker, there are limits to deterrence, something that they've admitted. That's why we don't torture people to deter them, right? But then they told us, look, that's the whole point. That's what we want. We want people to be deterred. But again, there are limits to this deterrence. We don't think necessarily what we want to do. No, thank you, madam. But then they told us that, look, they are already isolated and stigmatized. No. And this is where I move on to, the idea of rehabilitation. Because deterrence in jail cells is not just about the deterrence, it's not about the rehabilitation. But what's problematic on their side is that they never achieve that rehabilitation. Why? Because either the prisoner comes out completely insane and you have no rehabilitation whatsoever, or secondly, the whole point of rehabilitation is that while you are in that jail cell, you're able to interact with other individuals, you're able to talk to them, you're able to undergo counseling. There's no way you can undergo counseling when you're only 20 minutes in that jail cell anyway. But what's even worse is that they never have that form of rehabilitation time, the ability to interact with other individuals in order to have that kind of rehabilitation and that kind of knowledge or that kind of revelation in that case. But if I move on, yes, anyone?
We think that our drug, what it does not actually heighten the sensory itself, and however, it makes them feel like they're living down the reality where it is actually longer than the actual incident.
Okay, so let's assume that this is a hallucinogenic drug, where you believe, the best case scenario that you have lived a fake life for the last 20 years. That's still bad, because we think that what actually creates rehabilitation, and that wasn't their case to begin with, right? But in the best case scenario, this is so bad, because in the best case scenario, you're still having fake interactions with fake human beings, and that's not what creates rehabilitation. It's the real interaction that does that. So we don't think that takes place in any way. But here's where my substantive comes in, because we think the final tenet of justice is something they could never quite deal with, the idea of proportionality. And what happens now? We think that there's a necessary empathy gap that will happen between the public and these individuals, because a normal human being will never be able to understand what it means to sit there in a jail cell for 20 minutes, because they are visually and viscerally incapable of understanding or empathizing with that problem. That means that the public will now pressure the courts to institute such punishments as the norm, because they feel that this is what prisoners deserve. The problem is, now prison sentences can be extended indefinitely, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, the kind of psychological torture that we think is impossible for human beings to take. But they are forcing this upon individuals because they can't understand what it means for these things to happen. We think that's specifically bad, and that destroys the tenet of proportionality in our justice system. Finally, on the idea of society, right? We're going to go through this very quickly. What they told us is that, look, the prisoner's family, may necessarily suffer because that person's not there. But we think that in status quo, we already have the other mitigating circumstances, and we allow courts to take that into consideration when meting out sentences. What's even worse is that we think that if that prisoner is completely insane and can never come back to reality and be a normal functioning human being, your family is not going to benefit from that anyway. So for these reasons, Madam Speaker, we are so incredibly proud to oppose this motion.
And the DRO, I now invite the government whip.
We already established you in the first speaker that our entire technology is simply about making these prisoners feel like they have been through 10 years of prison when they actually been through 5. And we don't think we're living in this science fiction world that they're talking about. and their entire background of our policy is false, and that the entire case is false because the entire case is hinged upon this idea of sensory deprivation and on hurting prisoners. But even if you argue on, I will explain about why we will even we argue on their case, but further that we think that they have never listened to the nuances in our policy, they have never listened to what our policy was actually about. I have 3 main points for the day. Firstly, on this whole idea of rehabilitation and deterrence and overcrowding. Secondly, on the prisoners itself, which is where I will deal with, which is prisoners itself. And lastly, on the social need for this policy. Now, firstly, we're talking about severe overcrowding from first. The prisoner attacks like cattle in many countries, and because of this, no meaningful rehabilitation can occur. So there's simply no alone time to think about the crime. They're only thinking about trying to survive all the fights happening around them. Right? The purpose of prisons is not achieved because no deterrence effects achieved. No, sir. We think that these prisoners are not rehabilitation. They don't change when we live. Which is why deterrence isn't achieved. We think that what you're doing is to put criminals with criminals, right? That petty criminals suffer from bad influences, they make connections with other criminals, and that they perpetrate even more crime in the deed. Now, how do we solve this? They talk to us about UN, right? The UN coming in, being the big savior, and like giving them all like money to build better prisons. But we think that's simply not the case. We think that this problem of overcrowding cannot simply be solved in status quo, right? Because there's simply no political will to help. Then when no one cares about the conditions of prisoners in these prisons, we think that when the country is like that and no one cares about the conditions of these prisoners in the prison, there's not empathy by governments, right? It's because of the empathy by prisoners, governments don't care. We think it's rather ridiculous that you think that the UN will suddenly come in to solve the entire situation. We think that it needs to be we think that it needs to solve it through our policy. But moving on to the more important, no thank you sir, moving on to the more important idea of prisoners. We reject the idea that we are making them stand like in one place for 20 years with like time moving past them and then, no thank you sir, and then like not being able to understand the world around them. But further from what we established, we think that a psychological trauma for what happens in prison already happens in the first stage. Because precisely the second speaker talked about isolation, we think that if they were to say that isolation is something that doesn't be deserved by every single prisoner, then would they remove isolation altogether? And lastly, even if they accept that these are psychological trauma, yes ma'am.
For the first time in MIDP case, explain and characterize to us how exactly these people are going to live 10 years while they're only in their cell for 20 minutes. How exactly they will do that?
Ma'am, the motion states that you assume that the technology is there to allow this to happen. We think that what you're talking about of a science fiction world, of having the prisoners stand there, or the world is moving around them, is even more ridiculous, right, than having the technology to do so, which is what the motion really states. Even if we already accept that they will be psychologically trauma, we think that if they don't have the capacity to feel and think about anything around them as they so characterize, then why would they be sensory deprived? Why would they feel this trauma in the first place? So thank you, sir. We think that furthermore, about the proportionality of their crimes, right? We think that they do need to be fairly punished for their crimes, which is like not happening in status quo because of overcrowding, where the sentences of prisoners are not long enough simply because the country cannot stand to hold more prisoners, right? Where petty criminals are given like lighter sentences because prisons cannot afford to habitate them. Then the government don't really care about giving long enough sentences, about giving enough rehabilitation, about giving proper prisons for these prisoners because of all the overcrowding in prisons and the lack of space. We think that already prisoners feel as though like, the perception of time is not there in actual prison itself in status quo, and that if you were so concerned about these prisoners, then you would abolish prisons altogether. We think that if they would remove psychological trauma from prisoners altogether, then they would remove like almost all punishments of prisoners, because we think that deterrence at the end of the world, at the end of the day, deterrence and rehabilitation is more important factors than simply allowing these prisoners to feel like safe and happy. We think that at the end of the day, society is more important than what sensory deprivation that the prisoners might feel, right? Because we think that as as they've committed a crime, they have taken away the rights of the people, they don't deserve the rights anymore. But moving on lastly, my point about the social need of this policy. We told you that we stop the perpetration of crime because we stop the trickle-down effect that occurs on families where sole breadwinners are being put in prisons. We need a poverty cycle, which does occur from this policy, factors into the law of crimes happening, right? Because like these poor families don't really have parental guidance to help guide them up when they are very desperate and therefore they steal and the only response to this was that the court really do take this into concern, which is precisely our point that the court, we think that the court should separate all these issues from the actual crime itself, and the prisoners should be achieve the same retribution factor that they should be receiving. We tell you about the justice system, that the justice system is better because these courts are able to make the decision separate from whatever concerns they have. And if we allow the justice system to be better, we allow society to better trust in the justice system. That retribution is better achieved on outside when we have the actual proportionate punishment for these crimes. We actually allow for rehabilitation to occur when prisoners have alone time to think about their crimes. Now what have I told you today? Firstly, I told you about the problem of overcrowding. The overcrowdedness cannot be solved through any other means other than our policy. Secondly, I told you about the entire idea of rehabilitation and deterrence, how it is best achieved on our side and not achieved on their side at all because of the conditions of prisons. Last, I told you about prisoners, right? Why they aren't really that, they don't really feel the psychological trauma. And secondly, even if they want to feel so, that they deserve it, that this is a retributive factor, that they've given up their rights when they have committed the crime and they've taken away the rights of others. Lastly, I talked about the social need for this policy and how we better the society in general. Well, I said go inside of the proposition.
Yeah.
Thank you, Government Whip. I now invite the opposition whip.
If you listen very clearly to all three government speakers, they argued for what we call regulation of prisons, building of more prisons, funding of more, diverting more government funds to prison. All of which we don't mind agreeing to. But on side opposition, we stand for one very clear thing. There is a torture drug that you are going to implement on this kind of prisoners that is unproportional and unfair for individuals. I got three questions for you. Number one, I'm going to talk about what the drug actually does, right? It's very unfortunate that this is what we have to do because characterizations were basically unclear on both sides of the house. But secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why which side is fairer for the prisoners, and my third class will be which side better ensures justice in general. Number one, we're going to talk to you about the characterizations of what happens in this drug, right? Over here, proposition failed to understand basic science. We're talking about sending multiple neurons in your brain to adapt to the kind of sensory that they want, right? To ensure that time escalates in their brains. We're talking about a mismatch of the emotional and mental capacity with their physical capacity. Is this kind of mismatch and disjunct between the physical body as well as the mental capacity that creates the kinds of problems within these individuals because we think it's too much for their brains to handle in very simple terms. We're talking about the impact of what happens when they leave these prisons after they go through this kind of torturous kinds of the policy the government wants to impose today. We're talking about them unable to adapt to their basic human functions, where they lose their cognitive ability, where they lose their ability to think as how they were in the past. Now that when we furthermore stress that this is the only thing that happens, when you implement this kind of drug. We don't think anything else happens. Simply because this is the type of manipulation that the drug imposed on you, right? Go ahead.
Given that isolation already happens in prison cells, then the perception of time is already being warped. Tell me what this kind of trauma will have on the result.
Look, the perception of time is extremely different when you're talking about warping it, right? we're talking about the physical and mental capacity at least developing at the same pace in prisons, right? And furthermore, we argue to you that isolation doesn't really happen in prisons now, right? We think that what kind of the prison culture that they are taking is actually misconstrued in its nature. And furthermore, if you think that prison is really that bad, we don't mind regulating it, we don't mind changing the systems. That's what opposition is pushing for. Anyway. So I'm going to go in my second contention, idea of which is fairer for the prisoners. So over here I'm going to talk about two ideas, right? Number one, the idea of rehabilitation, and secondly, the idea of better justice system the government so wants to talk about. So the idea of rehabilitation, basically they told us with the implementation of their policy, rehab takes place in a much better manner. We've got three responses. Yes. Number one, we tell you that rehab does not actually happen in the kinds of instances, right? Characterizations by Benson and Cheung were extremely clear when they tell you that they lose their ability to basically think when they are under the influence of drugs. They don't have the mental capacity to follow, to do the kind of reflection that government wants to talk about. They basically lose their identity in the process, in and of itself. They basically lose track of what they have done, what the crime that they have performed during when they are under the influence of drugs. We tell you that they cannot keep up with the kind of mental capacity that you need to go through this kind of rehabilitation. But we tell you that we also furthermore tell you that under the kinds of influence, right, where you're only putting people there for 5, 10, 20 minutes, we tell you that the counseling that they want to put forth does not actually happen, right? But we also argue that the counseling that you are actually implementing is ineffective on these individuals, something that Cheung already talked about. But furthermore, we're going to tell you that how it makes it even worse for these individuals. And here's an extension point, right? Where we tell you that it perpetuates and influences the mindsets of these individuals when they are under this process. We're talking about them after going through the process of these drugs. What happens to these individuals? We tell you that their mindset is extremely disjunct from what they were from before. We tell you that they lose their ability and lose their right to their identities. We tell you they basically, in very simple terms, become crazy. We also tell you that this is a kind of policy solution mismatch the government is putting forth, right? If we really want rehabilitation to happen, we can always arrange for more counseling to happen in prisons, something that we are perfectly fine with. But we think that the kinds of torturous process that the government is implementing is something that does not facilitate rehabilitation. Anyway, and furthermore, we argue the harms of this rehabilitation that they want to put forth, right? In Cheung, we talk to you about the slippery slope that you're going to cross when you set the kinds of precedents for this kind of punishment. We're diluting the kinds of standards that we allow or we do not allow in society, or what we perceive to be acceptable punishment for the people, simply because of the types of failure to empathize with these kinds of punishments that you are meting out on these prisoners. We tell you that the people in society are going to push for even harsher harsher kinds of punishments on these individuals for them to go through under the influence of drugs, 100s, 200s, 300 years of time. We think that it's extremely torturous for these individuals. We think it's extremely unfair. Then they talk about better justice systems and how these individuals are actually important to some families. We agree that in some characterizations and in some contexts, these prisoners are the breadwinners of some families, and we agree. But what happens when they leave this kind of prisons under the influence of these drugs? We don't think they'll be going to work to earn money, right? We think they're basically going to have problems adapting to their physical body simply because their mind is 20, 30, 40 years older than their physical body. We think they're going to spend a lot more time adapting to their physical body than actually working to earn money for their families. We think this is counterintuitive to the kind of argumentation the government is putting forth. Last contention on how we better meet out justice, right? Over here, we're going to talk about two different sectors under justice. Number one, deterrence, and number two, proportionality. Under deterrence, right, we got two responses to the argumentation that they like to put forth on deterrence. Firstly, we tell you that deterrence cannot ever be fully effective, right? We think that deterrence can only be effective to a certain extent. We don't think there's ever going to be a zero crime rate in any society, right? But furthermore, we argue that there are limits and boundaries towards this deterrence that you can meet out on individuals. We agree that death penalty is a good thing for society. We think we want to maintain social order as well. We are perfectly agreeable to that on-site opposition, but we are not agreeable to the kinds of methods that the government is proposing to ensure this kind of death penalty. We think at all times we need to maintain some kinds of clear standards of what we allow in society. We think they dilute that. But furthermore, we argue that whatever benefits that they're going to take from this kind of death penalty is going to far outweigh the kind of cost that you're going to incur because of this kind of punishments on our side. And we think that this is extremely harmful to individuals. We think it's extremely harmful to justice systems. We're extremely proud to oppose. I didn't hear the chat.
750. 750.
Sorry.
To sum up, to end the side of opposition, I invite the opposition to reply.
Okay.
Okay, so after the MIDP's lengthy speech that my third op gave, right, there isn't really much for me left to say, but that's okay. We'll still try to sum up this debate and show you why we won this debate anyway, right? So let's talk about a few problems in this particular scenario. First, we're going to talk about how we solve the problem that population set up, and why it's best for society as a whole. Then we're going to talk about the prisoners and exactly how this affects them, something we debated a lot about, and then we'll tell you why our side won the characterization battle. Then, because they didn't offer us any alternative. And then after, we're going to talk about justice and who better serves it. So, firstly, we don't think that the solution to their problem of how people don't have enough alone time is to give people too much alone time, right? Which is something they never really quite understood. So how do we solve the problem that they talked about, right? The lack of alone time, overcrowding of prisons? We gave you a plethora of alternatives, right? I told you that you can get funding from the UN, you can go for privately owned prisons. Like Benson and Ming both also told you that there are a lot of other ways to do it, right? But we don't think that the way to do it, or even if there is a problem, that the way to solve it is this specific scenario. Why? So let's talk about the prisoners. How does this affect the prisoners? Right, let's do what they said. Because the characterization coming from outside was very clear. It's inevitable that when you put this kind of drug, the way these kind of drugs work, or the entire notion of extending time for an individual, is such that that person feels as if he's being sensorily deprived, right? He feels as if he's lost bodily autonomy. He essentially becomes a statue for what he assumes is 20 years. It's something they will explain to you why that happened, and it was very clear coming from outside. But their side was very evasive on the kind of characterization that they could come about. They never actually told you how these prisoners are going to perceive the 20 years. All they told us that, look guys, it's science fiction, that's not going to happen, man. But the thing is that they never actually told us how these prisoners are going to view that 20 years. So in the lack of actual characterization, we assume they accept what we say. So let's view their responses to this specific characterization. Because what did they tell us? They told us that, look, isolation already happens in prisons, it's not so bad. But we gave you a few life analysis for all three speakers, right? We told you clearly that isolation doesn't happen. If your problem is overcrowding, I don't think there's space for prisoners to be isolated anyway, right? But more importantly, we also told you that, look, counseling cannot help these prisoners, the alternative that they put forward. Because if it's 20 minutes, you can't exactly counsel them, and they can't hear you anyway. So we don't think that specifically helps in this particular instance. But then, we also told you the problem for these prisoners is the long-term impact that this policy has on them. The long-term impact where either they go completely insane, or if they do, retain some semblance of rationality at the end of it, they feel a complete disjunct because their mental age is now years older than how old they actually are. So it's kind of psychological trauma that we say these prisoners will never recover from and we never accepted. Finally, let's talk about justice and who serves it better. Because on the first level, we talked to you about rehabilitation, something they try to talk about, right? They told us that rehabilitation is all about reflection and time alone and etc. And I spend a lot of time alone, but that doesn't mean that I reflect a lot, right? How do you actually achieve rehabilitation? And we told you very clearly on our side that prisons are not just places where you lock people up to think about their lives, right? It's not a monastery. We told you that prisons are about a controlled environment where people can interact, and in that controlled environment, instill some level of discipline where they will hopefully recognize the error of their ways. The problem is, on their side, there is no interaction. There's only mental torture and sensory deprivation where you're alone with your thoughts for 10, 20 years. That doesn't facilitate rehabilitation because A, the person goes crazy. Usually he never rehabilitates. Or he just gets really angry at the establishment. And this kind of punishment is put on him. So we don't think rehabilitation is achieved. Secondly, we talked about deterrence, and we gave you very clear analysis on our side that there are limits to deterrence, right? If your fundamental problem is deterrence, there are a lot of ways to deter people. You can kill them, you can shoot them, you can torture them, you can rape them, but we don't do that because we respect their basic humanity. Finally, we talked about proportionality, something we never quite understood on our side. So we gave you clear analysis. But society will definitely and intrinsically want to make sure these people end up with like 100, 200 year sentence up next. 100, 200 year sentence. Because they cannot understand why it means to be under this drug. And we think for criminals to be held at the wings of a public that just want to see blood is essentially horrible. And for these reasons, because we protect the rights of the prisoners and because we better protect the humanity of society, we take this debate.
And the debate, I invite the government to reply.
Perhaps we do keep saying that this isn't a science fiction novel. However, we do say it for a reason. It's simply because their portrayal of this drug is quite fantastical. And we think that what is happening right now is reality. In reality, prisons are overcrowding. In reality, prisoners are not being deterred. The criminals are running free around the city, and that none of these prisoners actually get to rehabilitate because they're not even in prison in the first place. And to this debate is brought down to 2 points. Firstly, on who better achieves deterrence, and secondly, who better benefits the individual. So on to the first point on who better achieves deterrence. So we see the side opposition, well, they never really told us exactly why we didn't achieve deterrence. The only line of logic is that this actually caused them psychological trauma, and that these criminals didn't deserve that. So our response to that was that firstly, we think that if this so-called sensory deprivation is so feared, right, and it's so horrible, then isn't it deterrence in the first place? And as we've already told you through like our second and third speaker, is that like what is happening in their prison, in their reality, is quite similar to what is happening in our prison. All we do is actually lengthen the sentence and enhance the heightened experience. We think that in our case, we actually better solve this problem of deterrence because firstly, we think that the current problem of there being a lack of spaces in prison to hold petty criminals are solved because now there are obviously more spaces since prison sentences are shorter. Secondly, we think that proximity between criminals are not as close anymore, and that the chances of petty criminals being influenced by criminals who committed more severe crimes are lesser. And we think that this also changes the mindsets of these petty criminals in the sense that they no longer think that there's a lesser chance that they'll be arrested and put in prison cells because of the lack of prison space. We think that on their side, they allow a crime of culture within a country to foster. They allow rehabilitation to escape from these criminals. In the end, all the deterrence is not cheap. On our side, we also want, what our drug does, is that we focus and enhance the experience. I think that while the actual sentence is shorter, we actually allow the sentence to feel longer. And we agree that yes, it may be torturous. And we agree that yes, it may feel long. However, the difference is that while it is torturous, it is not torture. What is happening is simply a lengthening of the feeling of the prison sentence lengthening. We're not actually torturing them. And we think that, as we've really told you, if their sentences are so deprived, if they cannot achieve tell the distinction between reality and not reality, then how is it they are able to feel so psychologically traumatized? And yeah. We think that also in our case, where they are when they're given a longer prison sentence, they're better to able to understand the consequences of their actions. Now moving on to our second point on who better benefits the individual. Suicide opposition came out to tell us that they prevent psychological trauma, that they allow for proportionate crime, which we think doesn't really benefit the individual in the first place, right? Because they're not given the chance to turn over a new leaf. So firstly, how we respond to this psychological trauma, as I've already told you, these sentences would be deprived. We don't think that anything they brought up about this, about them not being able to adjust to their mental age will not happen, because what is going to happen is they're not going to feel as if they have 20, 30 years longer. While yes, their sentence is increased, however, they're not actually going to translate this into reality. Now, after they came up to respond to that substantive or proportionate crime, we think that this is where we tell you that we better achieve proportionate crime. That it's not an extremely long or extremely unfair sentence. That the actual sentence is quite short, and that on their side, proportionate crime is not achieved because like because prisons are so overcrowded, criminals receive shorter sentences than they deserve. And in our case, while we lengthened the experience, the actual prison sentence is still shorter, and therefore we think the sentence is still proportionate to their crime, even more so in our case. So, lastly, we think that we do better, achieve rehabilitation, that we do better achieve deterrence. Because of all of this, I'm very proud.
And for debaters, we cross the floor in the room are very ready.
Sorry? We score first and we tell you the issue, or do you want to do it like we look at the clash rate and then we can discuss the clash?
Yeah, you can tell me like the issues why you give the win, and then the score you tell me at the end. So
Okay.
like, just discuss it.
What is score?
You score the usual and then you just half the score. So you score out of 100, you give them a score and then you just half that score. We score first, or do you want to do it?
Are you guys done with your questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah. I think I just need to switch this off and then come. Yeah, can.